All right, so let's get started on chapter 5, tissues. And for many of you who have already had, for all of you who have already had lab, some of this is going to be a review, and that's fine. All right, we're going to talk about tissues in the concept of what they are and characteristics of each of them. Your lab, it has some of that in it, right? But really your lab, the lab course, you are going to be challenged with identifying these tissues, okay? I am not asking you to identify what reticular cartilage looks like or what hyaline cartilage looks like, right? I'm asking you to know the characteristics of epithelial tissue, of connective tissue, right, in general, okay? So chapter 5 is tissues. There are 4 types of tissues, main tissue types in the body, right? Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Okay? We are going to be concerned with epithelial and connective tissue today in this chapter. The chapter does talk about muscle and nervous tissue, but later on in the semester, we are going to cover the muscular system. We'll talk about muscle tissue then. Then we'll cover the nervous system. We'll talk about neurons and their tissues then. Okay? But for right now, let's talk about epithelial and connective tissue. Okay? So, generally, tissues are defined as groups of similar cells that perform a certain function. Okay? So cells that look similar, act similar, they do something together, right, collaboratively to perform a certain function, such as providing protection, right? Making a barrier, offering support, okay? They all do something together. And the study of tissues is called histology, all right? So that you know, when you're looking at those histological sections of the microscope slides, that's what you're doing, right? Histology. Said the 4 types of tissues, and because they are 4 types, they have varied structure and function that distinguish them from one another, okay? There's a reason why connective tissue is different than epithelial tissue, all right? Muscles and nerves. Nerves conduct electrical stimuli. Muscles respond to electrical stimuli and contract. They have different properties. So let's start with epithelial tissue. Oh, 1 second. So let's go back to epithelium. Epithelium also refers to as epithelial tissue. Okay? It is composed of layers of cells, 1 or more layers of cells. Okay? And the cells themselves have little space between them. All right? So an epithelium would look something like this. So if these were the outlines of the cells, there would be no space between the cells. Okay? There's no space between those cells. Well, that's not right. Hold on. Pause. There we go. So these cells here, okay, there's no space between them. Okay? You'll find epithelium that covers body surfaces. The best well-known, I guess the first well-known or first organ that is composed of epithelial tissue that comes to mind is the skin, right? It covers the outside, right? It's your biggest organ. It is composed of epithelial tissue, almost predominantly, okay? You'll find epithelium lining body cavities and organs. So those serous membranes we talked about last week, right? Parietal and visceral peritoneum and parietal and visceral pleura, those are also have at least some function of, or some component of epithelial tissue. Epithelium will form the majority of glands, okay? So most glands are epithelial tissue, right? So you think about, give me an example of a gland. Pituitary gland. You find like the one that's really not just epithelial tissue, because actually half the pituitary is actually like nervous tissue, and the other half is epithelial. Okay? Sweat glands, right? Sebaceous glands. Those are all epithelial tissue. Okay? Some characteristics of epithelial tissue. They have what's called cellularity, right? If something has cellularity, it means it has lots of cells, okay? Tightly packed cells. They also have this thing what's called a high mitotic index. What does that mean? A high mitotic index. They replace themselves a lot. They undergo mitosis a lot. Okay? So lots of mitosis means they reproduce, they repair, they help maintain their tissue. Okay? Think about the skin, because that's our first epithelial tissue that comes to mind. Right? The surface of the skin are dead cells. But underneath the deeper layers, there's a layer of cells that are reproducing and providing growing new skin cells to maintain that whole organ. Okay? They also, epithelial tissue exhibits what we call polarity. Okay? Polarity is just saying that one side of the cell or the group of cells is different than the other side. Okay? So if I have a group of cells here that look like this, is this the A side different than the B side right now? Those are nuclei. Would the A side look like different than the B side? No. Okay? But if I then added a connection, an anchor point where these cells are attached to, now is the A side different than the B side? Yes. Okay? The A side, or apical surface, is free. What does free mean? It means it is not attached to other cells. It could be exposed to the air, like in your skin, okay, or in your respiratory membrane. It could be exposed to some type of fluid, but it's not attached to another layer of cells. Okay? So we have what's called a free apical surface. The other side, the basal surface, is attached to this thing, this purple thing. It's a connective tissue called the basement or basal membrane. Okay? That basement membrane anchors. It allows the anchoring of these cells to where they need to go. So if they didn't have an anchor point, they would just kind of like pull off. Right? And there are junctions between the cells that hold them in place. They connect them to one another on the lateral surface. And there's also junctions that hold them to the basement membrane. Right? We call it anchoring junctions. So now they can't be, if I was to pull on this, we have like these micro tweezers and pull on this cell this way, these anchoring points are going to hold it in place. And then also, if I broke those anchors, the connections between them are going to hold them together. It groups the cells together. Okay, so these intercellular junctions are important. They hold the cells together and also prevent things from passing between the cells. Okay, material cannot pass between the cell because of these junctions between them. Yes?
Are the junctions considered apical or basal, or is it just neither?
The junctions, you can classify the junctions as basal if they are attaching the cell to the basement membrane. Okay, they're like anchoring junctions, right? The lateral ones, we don't talk about them as being apical because there's nothing up there at the top. Okay. All right, these are between cells or to a tissue. But there's no junctions at the apical surface because there should not be anything. At some point, at the top layer, there should be a free surface. Okay? Other questions? So how do we classify epithelial tissues? Okay? We can classify epithelial tissues based upon asking two questions. Okay? The first question is, how many layers of cells that go between the apical and the basal surface? Okay? If the answer is 1, if it's equal to 1, that's what type of epithelium? Simple. Don't be afraid, we're all friends here. Let's speak up. If it's greater than 1, it's what? Stratified. Okay, so these would be considered rules for ID epithelium. Okay? First rule, layers. Simple, stratified, we either have 1 or more than 1. Okay? Our second rule, or second question, is what is the shape of the cell at the apical surface? Doesn't matter if it's 1 layer of cells or multiple layer of cells. We only classify, we will only care about the cell at the apical surface. And so the shapes can be what? Shapes can be like this flat cell. Okay, if it's flat, it's called what? Squamous. Okay? If it's kind of equal in height and width, kind of looks like a couple die or dice, right? The kind of square shape. That's what? Cuboidal. And then finally, if they are taller than they are wide, kind of this rectangle shape, that is columnar. Okay? So based upon those rules, you have a possibility of having simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar. Stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. Those offer you 6 basic epithelial tissues. Now, with any rule, there are what? There's always exceptions, okay? Can never just be straightforward. The exceptions we have 2 exceptions. The first is a group of cells that look like there's multiple layers, but they're not. Okay? So we have a cell that looks like this. Okay? We have cells that kind of look like that. And you have a basement membrane. And then you have nuclei that are like that. Okay, so those blue dots are your nuclei. Multiple nuclei at different levels. That should kind of inform you of, that looks like it's stratified. If you see multiple nuclei at multiple levels, you should start to think stratified. Okay? However, this cell extends from top to bottom, from apical to basal surface, from apical to basal, from apical to basal. There's not multiple layers of cells. So it's what we call pseudo-stratified. What does pseudo mean? Pseudo means fake or false. So it looks stratified, but it's not really. Okay? That's one exception. You'll find pseudo-stratified in your trachea. Okay? Pseudo-stratified in the trachea of the lining of your trachea. The second exception is similar to that in that in one state, and sometimes it looks stratified, and other times it looks simple. Okay? So in some cases, you'll see it looks like this with the basement membrane. And then other times, it'll look like this. With the basement membrane. Okay? And this occurs because it actually switches back and forth from this form to that form. Okay? It undergoes a transition. Okay? This is called transitional epithelium. Okay? On the left side, this is the distended or stretched version. Okay? And over here is the relaxed version. You find this overlying or lining your bladder. Okay? So the urinary bladder is covered by transitional epithelium. Now think about how the structure of this epithelium, what it does. What happens with the bladder as you drink water throughout the day and it goes on? It expands, right? But the waste that you're producing, the urea that you're producing, is not good for the cells underneath it. So there still has to be a barrier that's formed between the epithelium and the contents of the bladder. So as the bladder expands, it goes from this relaxed state to a more distended state, right? Maintaining the barrier between the contents of the bladder and the cells underneath. Okay? And then you void the bladder, you go to the bathroom, urinate, and then it returns back. It transitions from one state to another. But here, when you first look at it, it might look stratified because they kind of look like they're on top of one another. Okay, so those are the two rules. So basically you have 8 epithelial tissues. All right, start with 6. Okay, I'm going to tell you 2 more that are very rare. 2 of the ones I already told you are very rare. That's what I meant to say, not 2 additional ones. You only have 8. Okay? So let me go back. So here's the structure of epithelium: apical free surface, basal surface, basement membrane, right? Usually connected to a connective tissue. What do you also notice is not present in the epithelial tissue that you do see in the connective tissue? Anything? Nothing? What's present in the connective tissue that's not present in the epithelial tissue? Fibers, we'll talk about those in a second. Connective tissue has fibers, yes. What's this right here? This blood vessel is present, okay? Blood vessels are present in most of your tissues, okay? That is how the body delivers oxygen and picks up waste, okay? So notice that epithelial tissue does not have blood vessels. Epithelial tissue is what we call avascular. It does not have blood vessels in it. So the materials that the epithelium needs have to diffuse to and from the blood vessel through the connective tissue. Okay? So epithelial tissue will never be very far, will always be very close to at least blood supply, okay? Because it needs to move oxygen from the blood to the tissues and CO2, right? And glucose from the blood to the tissue. It needs all the stuff the other stuff does. Okay, does that make sense? Now, she mentioned that some epithelial tissue have modifications that are found, okay? Modifications at the apical surface. In some cases, they have these little hair-like structures, which will beat back and forth and move mucus or move whatever's at the apical surface around, okay? That's cilia. Some other tissues have extensions of the cell membrane, which kind of look like ridges or folds. Okay? The cilia are not extensions of the cell membrane. They go like they're hair-like structures, proteins that extend away from the cell membrane. That's why I put it in purple, because it's actually part of the whole cell. These are microvilli. They are extensions of the cell membrane that increase surface area, important for absorption of nutrients and material. Okay? But the apical surface will also be characterized by, may be characterized depending. Some of these have modifications, some epithelium do not. What do they do? What does the skin do? Physical protection, okay? Protects the underlying tissue from abrasion, irritation, from the elements from the outside, right? Loss of water from the tissue underneath. That's why burns are such a problematic, like what is the problem with having someone who has severe burns? Well, you disrupt the epithelium, and the clinical problem then is loss of fluid loss to the environment, which causes dehydration. Okay? Epithelium exhibit what's called selective permeability. Because these cells are linked to one another with those connections, right? So if we have connections between cells, right, and they would connect either, prevents things from going between them, right? It provides a full barrier, a full separation from one side to the other. So the material that's going to move from one side to the other has to pass through the cell. So the function of the cell then, it can let certain things pass and exclude other things. Okay? That's important, right, for the function of overall organs. Okay, that's selective permeability. Epithelial cells, many of them, produce some sort of secretion. When we talked about serous membranes, and I just said earlier that they are epithelial tissue, what do serous membranes produce? What do serous membranes produce? Serous fluid. Okay, that's their secretion, which allows for reduction of lubrication and movement of organs. Okay? And some are further specialized to secrete things, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. Okay? Epithelium do have nerve endings. They provide for sensation. All right? You'll have hair cells that go through them. There's nerve endings, right? But there are no blood vessels. So they supply information to the nervous system as well. Okay, so there's our classification. Squamous, cuboidal, columnar. You'll note that this picture right here up top, I drew it like this, right, on the side. That's a lateral view if I was looking like that. But if I was looking down, it would look something like a hexagonal tile or something like that. And the cuboidal and columnar might look the same if you were looking straight down, right? A superior, inferior view. Okay? Any questions? Classifying epithelium. 2 questions. All right? Here's a flow chart. Okay? So, first off, we have Simple or stratified, one or more layers. Simple squamous, we talked about. Flat, one layer of cells. Simple cuboidal, one layer of cells that look like squares. Simple columnar, right? One layer of cells that look like rectangles. We talked about pseudostratified and stratified squamous, multiple layers of flat cells. Okay? These two right here, stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, are rare. There's only like one or two places in the body that you see them. Right? Basically, they're found in the urethra and some parts of the reproductive tract. That's it. Okay? So those two are very rare. I bet those two will not be on your exam, on your lab exam. Okay? But if I was to draw one out, if I drew a hypothetical epithelial tissue and I said, here's your basement membrane, those are cells. What's that? What would that epithelium be if these are the cells? Simple squamous. Okay, so now what if I did this? Ask your questions. What is it? How many layers of cells? All right, we're stratified. We're making progress. Good. What's the shape of the cell at the apical surface? I drew it kind of cuboidal columnar, right? I don't care what it is, right? You based upon I want you to know that it's stratified, and it's the shape of the cell at the apical surface. It's not stratified squamous, right? Now, if I was to kind of, I should have like something like that if I wanted columnar. I would make a definitive structure difference, okay? It was not going to be somewhere in between, okay? But the point is, apical surface that determines what you name it. The last thing on this page is this, okay? Stratified squamous epithelium can further be characterized as either keratinized or non-keratinized. Stratified squamous epithelium, multiple layers of flat cells, lots of layers. So it protects the underlying tissue from abrasion, irritation, okay? Your skin is what we call keratinized. Your hair and your fingernails are made up of a protein called keratin. Your skin, the cells on the surface, are dead cells that have been filled with keratin, right? The same protein that makes up your hair and fingernails, just in a different configuration, okay? So dead cells. Now the non-keratinized, the most superficial layer of cells are alive, okay? The lining of your oral cavity is made up of non-keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. So how many of you in high school biology took the toothpick and scraped your inside of your cheek and then put it on there, right? What you did, and they kind of look like those tiles, right? What you did was you scraped off the stratified squamous epithelium, the non-keratinized, and put it on there, okay? You wouldn't be able to see that same thing if you did it to your skin. Make sense? Okay. Now the other part about epithelial tissue is that it makes up glands, right? Glands can be as simple as one cell, or they can be multicellular structures, right? They are predominantly made up of epithelial tissue or epithelial cells. Glands will secrete some substance, a hormone, sweat, sebum, ceremonious wax, you name it, saliva, okay, to be excreted out of the body, okay? Mucin, electrolytes are all examples, right? Mucin is the substance that gives saliva its kind of like stickiness. Saliva is mostly water, okay? And then it has like this, it's viscous. It's a little thicker than water, right? It's a little slimy. That sliminess is the mucin, okay? Any questions on epithelium? We can classify glands into two main groups, endocrine or exocrine. Okay? Endo mean, what does the prefix endo mean? Endoscopy. Inside, good. Okay? Inside, and the root word crine means secretion. Wow, that's really bad. ION. Okay? So endocrine, the secretion is going to stay inside the body. Okay? Endocrine glands produce hormones, goes into the blood, targets another place inside the body. Okay? Exocrine glands, exo means what? Outside. Okay? These epithelial tissues produce something that will somehow get through a duct and end up outside of the gland and eventually outside of the body in some way. Okay? But it's classified, exocrine glands have a duct that will transport the secretion out. Sweat glands, mammary glands, salivary glands, right? Parts of the pancreas are considered exocrine. Okay? It means it's going to be outside the body. So we're going to look at a couple types of glands. First, unicellular ones. And I include this in the lecture because this is something that will inform you, you'll see in lab. Okay? The unicellular exocrine glands, some are called goblet cells. Most common type, most one you'll see, are goblet cells. All right? And goblet cells produce mucus that will help protect the underlying epithelial tissue. Okay? So it's this gland, it's kind of this cell you see here produces these secretory vesicles, and then they release them on the surface of the epithelium. Okay? You'll find goblet cells in your small intestines, in your trachea, in your stomach. Think about the stomach. What do we know about the contents of the stomach? How would you describe it? Acidic. All right? Really acidic. The contents of the stomach is about pH 1. Okay? That's really acidic. And that's important for what the stomach does. But that pH, that acid, is also a problem from the cells underneath it. Okay? It could cause big problems. So what the goblet cells in the stomach do, they produce mucus that covers the lining of the stomach and helps protect it and offers a protection, a protective barrier from the contents of the stomach, right? And the same thing would happen, similar thing would happen in the small intestine, right? You have this mucus which allows the food, digested food to pass through. Okay, you'll find goblet cells in the trachea. As you breathe in, right, you breathe in particles from the air, pollen, right, dust, whatever. The mucus that's produced by these goblet cells trap that debris and prevent it from getting in your lungs. Then the cilia there push the mucus up, and then it's back up towards the throat, and then it's swallowed. Okay? So they perform a distinct purpose. The bottom panels here on the left show you an epithelium. What do you think this epithelium is? Here's the basement membrane. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to outline it in black. What's this up here? What would that be considered? Are there cells up there? So what was that? What side would that be? Be the apical surface, right? Usually there's what we call a lumen or an opening, right? Okay? So now, what is these cells? What would you call this? and why? Would you call it simple or stratified? Why would you call it simple?
I only see one layer.
Okay, so she only sees one layer of cells. Would anyone call it stratified? No? Yes? Here's the hint. Look at the number of nuclei, these dark dots at the bottom. Okay? How many layers of nuclei do you have? So you have multiple. And then the picture to the right is actually showing you an artistic rendering of that picture on the left. Or maybe you can see it a little bit better. Blue being the nuclei, right? You have multiple layers of nuclei, yes? But you're right, the cells only extend one layer. So what type of cell epithelium are we looking at? Say it loud and proud. Pseudo-stratified. Good. All right, so this is the type of thinking that I want you to get to do, especially when you go to lab. When you're sitting there looking at a microscope or a picture, and the professor's asking you, identify this epithelial tissue. How many layers? What's the shape of the cell? Where's the apical surface? And then is it one of those two exceptions? Okay? Good. And then here you can see the goblet cells, right? Are these light purple things, this orange thing that will extend onto the surface and produce mucus. Okay? Multicellular glands are more cells, more complex. Okay? There's a duct in these exocrine glands, right? On these glands. So here's a duct, and usually the duct is just a transmission. Okay? It's where a conduit, where the secretion that's going to be produced by the gland itself is going to move through. Okay, so the duct is just a passageway. At the end point are these things called acinus, or acini, plural. And those are the specialized epithelial tissue that produce the secretions. Okay, so saliva, sweat, etc. are produced in these specific epithelial tissues, usually at the end of the ducts. The ducts are lined by epithelial tissue as well, but they're not secreting the substance. Okay? And so on most of these, this is an exocrine gland, they are covered on the outside, surrounded by a fibrous capsule, and then sometimes that connective tissue can extend in and break them up into different areas, parts, or what we call lobes. This is a very complicated slide. I'm not going to ask you to identify the different types of glands, okay? I'm showing you this because it can be very complex. It can be simple with just this little tube, right, or a simple acinus, or you kind of group them all together and form these more complex things, okay? So salivary glands, mammary glands are like this compound acini. They're very complex. Sweat glands, right, that are on your skin are basically these simple coiled tubular ones. They kind of has this jumbled tube that's found in the skin. Okay? Can be very complex. How the epithelial cells that produce the secretion, how they release it, can also be categorized into three different groups. Okay? Either one, which is kind of either the cell is going to produce its secretion and release it like you would think of anything, right? It's just going to release what it's produced, and the cell is going to continue to do that. That's A. American gland, right? The cell is going to produce the secretion, release it by exocytosis. All right? The cell goes on, continue doing, no problem. The apical gland in the middle, a little different. It produces the secretion. The secretion is collected at the apical surface, right? And then parts of the cell membrane actually break off as the cell's producing it. So parts of the cell are going with it. In this case, the apical gland, those epithelial tissue are constantly being repaired. Okay? And then third, the holocrine gland, the secretion is collected in the whole cell, right? It's collected in the whole cell. Instead of just parts of the cell membrane being released at the apical surface, the whole cell breaks down. The cell dies and releases the contents into the duct. That's what a holocrine gland is. In that case, the cells have to continue dividing to provide more vessels, right, for the secretion to be released. 3 ways that epithelial tissue release secretions. Okay? Questions on that? Right? First one, just exocytosis. Apical gland, parts of the cell break down. Holocrine gland, the whole cell breaks down. Pretty easy, right? Now we get to connective tissue. And connective tissue, in my opinion, is harder. It's the hardest one that you're going to have to identify because of the diversity of the tissues. And they're pretty close to one another, and when you look at them, right, we're going to try to talk about it. Right? So most diverse, most widely distributed tissues, connective tissue, they support, protect, and bind organs together. We're going to talk about connective tissue, that it has 3 distinct characteristics. All connective tissue has to have some type of cell that is separated by some space, right? Epithelial tissue has cells, but they're packed together. Connective tissue has cells, but they can be separated by something that's outside the cell. Has to have some type of protein fiber, okay, within that space outside the cell. And that space outside the cell also has what we call ground substance, and we'll talk about what that is. Examples of connective tissue, think about it's going to bind, support, protect. Okay? Bind, support, protect. A tendon. Support, yes? What does the tendon do? Connects what? Attaches muscles to bone. Okay? So it binds a bone to a muscle. All right? A ligament binds a bone to a bone. Does it support? Yes, it does. Does it protect? Maybe not so much. Adipose tissue, fat. Okay? Does it protect? Yes, it cushions from outside trauma. Cartilage, support. Bone, support, protection. Blood binds all of our organs together. Right? It is the transport where we have moving things away. So in those examples, we have a liquid substance in blood, a solid substance in bone, a cushy substance in adipose tissue, and a rubbery substance in cartilage. All right, so why is it so diverse? It has to do with, well, what are the makeup of that ground substance that separates the cells apart from one another? Okay, so all connective tissue shares 3 basic characteristics: cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. The cells. Some cells can stay in the same area, and what we call resident cells, right? Or they can be wanderers. They can move around. Okay? 2 classes. Resident cells, stationary, they stay in the connective tissue, they don't move around. Think about the types of connective tissue we just talked about. Bone. Do bone cells move around? Hopefully not. Okay? No. But there's mainly support, maintain, and repair. That's what the resident cells do. They support, maintain, and repair the connective tissue. So an osteocyte, a bone cell that lives inside your femur, it is producing the extracellular matrix, the stuff that separates it from the other cells, and maintaining your structure of your bone itself. Okay, some examples of resident cells include fibroblasts. Okay, anytime you see this part of the word blasts, it means that cell is going to produce something. Okay, chondroblast, osteoblast, fibroblast are three examples. Right, fibroblasts will produce the fibers, some of the fibers that are present in types of connective tissue. Okay? Usually they're flat, kind of like these tapered end cells. Adipocytes, fat cells, they don't move around, thankfully, either. Okay? Provide cushion and protection for where they intend to be. They cluster together, right, and they have this, actually have a limited amount of extracellular matrix, but they're clustered together as a whole tissue. Wandering cells, they continuously move around through the connective tissue. And a lot of these wandering cells are components of your immune system. Okay? They reside in the skin or in the connective tissue that underlies the skin, the dermis, right, that part of it, and provides for protection. All right? I'm allergic to cats, so if I get a cat scratch here on my skin, it doesn't bleed, right? So I didn't break any blood vessels, but my skin gets really, really red, right? And if it breaks the skin a little bit, it'll get really kind of like weepy. You get more fluid there. Why does it get red? Does anyone know? Why does it get weepy? Why does it swell a little bit? Yes? So there's inflammation and immune response, right? Yes, right? So the cells that are there, there's a group of cells that are called mast cells, right? And these mast cells, and other types of white blood cells, leukocytes as well. But mast cells will recognize foreign stuff like my cat allergy, right? Those proteins from the cat, get in, and they'll release substances that make the blood vessels dilate, make them wider. More blood goes through. That's where the redness comes from, right? It makes the blood vessels leaky. That means that more fluid comes out of the blood vessels and into the surrounding tissue. That's where it starts to get puffy, okay? So the mast cells are a type of allergic response, okay? So those are mast cells. They produce heparin and histamine. So when you take an antihistamine, right, well, so what you do for Benadryl or Claritin, it helps prevent seasonal allergies, sneezing, puffiness of the eyes. That's what it's doing, okay? Other cells, plasma cells, are the ones that produce antibodies to foreign substances. So when something is encountered, that antibody can immobilize that foreign substance, prevent it from causing a systemic infection or infection in general. Okay? So those are the type of cells, resident or wandering cells. Let's talk about the fibers. Fibers are meant for support and strengthen the tissue. They also allow the tissue to do fun things. When you squeeze your cheek and pull your skin, okay, you can pull it in all different ways, right? Yes, you can pull it up, down. And then when you let go, what happens? It goes back, right? That property of being able to pull it and stretch it left, right, up and down, right? And the fact that you don't tear it off, that strength, is a property of the collagen fibers that are produced there. All right, so collagen fibers are one type of fiber. All right, and that's what you see here in this, the background pink. Those are all collagen fibers in this picture. Okay? They provide strength, support. Your bones are actually made up of collagen fibers that have been calcified. Right, and provide, like, that's what bone is. The hair-like fibers over here, right, they look like little hairs. Those are elastic fibers. It allows your skin or whatever connective tissue you're pulling that looks like this to return back to its normal shape. Okay? Elastic fibers. You might find elastic fibers in elastic cartilage. Okay? And then you have reticular fibers on this side, and I'm going to outline what they look like so you can see it a little bit. They form this kind of netting. All right, so I'm outlining them in yellow. These are reticular fibers. They form this net kind of structure as a way of slowing moving cells down. So in between that netting are all like nuclei of lymphocytes. Those are cells that would normally move, but they are kind of held in one place and allow for this lymph node to do its job. All right, so reticular fibers. They're found, any or all of these can be found in connective tissue. Now let's talk about ground substance, which really gives connective tissue its diversity. You could have a liquid, a solid, or a semi-solid state for a connective tissue. Blood is a liquid, cartilage is a semi-solid, and bone is a solid. All right, so that ground substance and how it's arranged, what it's composed of, determines what the what the formation, the structure of the connective tissue is. Collectively, with the ground substance, with the protein fibers, that's what we collectively call the extracellular matrix, the space between cells. What is the ground substance made of? All right, one of them is what we call a glycose aminoglycan. Okay? Glyco, GLYC, right, always refers to a carbohydrate or a sugar. Okay? So this is a compound that's a carbohydrate linked to an amino group, or like a part of an amino acid that's linked to another carbohydrate. Okay? It's a large molecule. Large. Okay? They are building blocks for carbohydrates. The big thing about them is that they are negatively charged and they are hydrophilic. Okay? Whenever I think about these, I think of Eva Longoria commercial, and she says it's hyaluronic acid. Has anyone ever seen that commercial? Yes? Hyaluronic acid is a glycosaminoglycan. Okay? And that commercial is for face cream, right? And the lotion is to help diminish fine lines. Okay? So she's promoting hyaluronic acid, this glycosaminoglycan, to put on your face, which will help diminish fine lines. How does it do that? Well, because this gag is hydrophilic. What does hydrophilic mean? It attracts water. So I put this substance on my face that attracts water. What's going to happen to the tissue underneath? Attracts water, water's going to go to it, right? What happens to your skin? It looks, right? That fine line fills in with water. That's how it works. Okay? Now, gags can be to proteins to form a proteoglycan. So now that hyaluronic acid attaches to something on the cell, forms a proteoglycan. Okay? These perform important functions. And then we have glycoproteins. Different, they're still sugar and protein, right? Glyco, sugar, carbohydrate attached to a protein instead of a protein attached to a gag. The glycoproteins are adherent. So remember we talked about how the epithelial tissue will connect, say this is your basement membrane, and the epithelial tissues, cells, right, connect to the basement membrane, and there's anchoring points, right? Talked about those anchoring points? These adhering proteins, glycoproteins, are where those epithelial tissue connect to, that anchor them. So it's important that they're there because they're going to provide the anchor point for other tissues so they can connect and bind organs together. Okay? Questions?